comics writer is just what I've always wanted to do. It's never a choice that I've made because my mom said that like I learned to talk so that I could tell her I was going to be a professional cartoonist. Like I was making plans at that point, and then I just by the time I turned 6, I was right like I'm ready to go pro. I've been doing this long enough, and I started pitching comics to newspapers. And I kept bothering the same newspaper until they finally hired me at the age of 16. So I'd bother them every year for 10 years until finally they're like, okay, kid, fine. All right, here, we'll give you a job. And I've just been going ever since then. I don't know what caused me to become obsessed with that, but it's what I've always wanted to do.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Living the Next Chapter. I have a great creative person on the podcast. I love going through his website. I'm mesmerized as we do this. Ryan Estrada is on the podcast. We're going to be talking about his journey as an artist, author, and adventurer. He's lived many places and done many things. And when you go to his website, you're going to find probably some of the most creative stuff I've seen in a very long time. Ryan's here to talk about his journey and all the things he's up to. Ryan, thank you so much for being part of Living the Next Chapter. Glad to have you here.
I appreciate you having me.
It's amazing. Now, we chatted just briefly before we hit record, but let everybody know where you are in this big world of ours.
Well, I'm coming in from Busan, South Korea. If your listeners don't know where that is, if you've seen the movie Black Panther, there's a scene where he drives across that brightly colored bridge and jumps around on cars. That's literally outside my window. So I'm coming into you from there. As I mentioned, I call myself an artist, author, adventurer because for the last several decades, I've been traveling all over the world. For a long time, I was moving to a new country every year, but I've kind of been settled in Korea for a bit now. Just because I love going around the world and having experiences and having those experiences affect the stories that I tell, whether I'm writing fiction or nonfiction. It's all based on the people that I've met and the things that I've done. And boy, I've done some really dumb things as I've traveled the world, and I've done some amazing things, and I've met amazing people. So I love to funnel it all into creative projects.
Awesome. Where does this creativity come from? Is this from your family? Is this self-taught? What's the origin of all this creativity for you?
Well, being a comics writer is just what I've always wanted to do. It's never a choice that I've made because my mom said that like I learned to talk so that I could tell her I was going to be a professional cartoonist. Like I was making plans at that point, and then by the time I turned 6, I was right like I'm ready to go pro. I've been doing this long enough, and I started pitching comics to newspapers, and I kept bothering the same newspaper until they finally hired me at the age of 16. So I'd bothered them every year for 10 years until finally they're like, okay, kid, fine. All right, here, we'll give you a job. And I've just been going ever since then. I don't know what caused me to become obsessed with that, but it's what I've always wanted to do.
It's amazing. I love your characters, like your caricatures and there's so much variety to what you do as well. As I scroll through the website, I keep looking off screen here and just kind of scrolling through. There's so much here. So you're on top of all of the artistry and all the things you're doing with your caricatures, you're also an author as well. You're writing. Mm-hmm. So where did the idea of becoming an author and turning your art into words, how did that happen for you?
I mean, I've always just wanted to tell stories, and the type of stories I wanted to tell were always changing because I mentioned like wanting to be a cartoonist that young, but when they finally hired me at 16, the comic that I made was about an orange cat who's too lazy to chase mice. And that was because the only life experience I had was reading Garfield. And so I had nothing else to draw from. And the traveling just started kind of as an accident. I graduated from animation school the same year the entire animation industry got laid off. And any jobs I thought I was going to have no longer existed. So I was complaining to a friend in Instant Messenger at like 3 a.m. And they said, hey, did you hear about this thing in Korea where they need English teachers so bad they'll buy you a plane ticket and have an apartment waiting for you? And I'm like, no, but I'm going to do it. And by 4 a.m. I had a job. And then I realized that I loved traveling and making comics so much that I just kept doing that and kept having new kind of experiences to turn into stories. And it's kind of all developed from there that now, like you mentioned, I do so many different things, which is not normally a thing in writing. I actually for the longest part of my career, I didn't have an agent, and that's because I had this disastrous call with a really, really famous agent that like a lot of people, the most successful people in comics have this same agent, and I got myself a meeting with her, and she's like, "Well, what are you working on now?" And I said, "I'm doing this one thing for adults and this one thing for teens, and one thing for kids." And she's like, "Excuse me, you're not allowed to do that." And I'm like, "I'm what?" She's like, "How?" She's like, "How dare you? Like, you can't make stuff for different. If you make books for 8 to 12-year-old boys, you make books for 8 to 12-year-old boys, and that's all you do for the rest of your life." And I'm like, "My brain can't work that way. I'm sorry." And so
Wow.
I went on my own for so long. I know I'm going on tangents here, but that's what I tend to do.
Yeah.
But and then I eventually, when I met my current agent, and I was really scared to tell her that like I had different ideas, and I'm like, what if I maybe wanted to make a book also for this audience? And she's like, yeah, fine, write whatever you want. It's my job to sell it. And I'm like, I'm allowed to write whatever I want. Yay.
And the pigeons were
Yeah.
released and everything was great and off you go, right? I love it. It's amazing. Okay, so I love to kind of find this out. As a musician, I love to be inspired by other musicians, and some of them make me want to practice and do better. Some of them want me to put my guitar away because they're so good. Who for you is an inspiration in what you do? Who do you look up to, and who gives you that kind of push to keep going forward?
I mean, it's always evolving. Like as I mentioned, as a kid, it was obviously Jim Davis, the creator of Garfield,
Yeah, yeah,
because that's what came every day in the newspaper and was delivered to my house. And the older I fell in love with Chuck Jones, who was one of the famous Looney Tunes directors, created like Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner and a lot of those things. And I was obsessed with his like storytelling and character building skill, the way he could like show a lot of personality in like the way someone's upper lip twitched, like that little
right.
level of detail. Artists I look up to now are people like Jeff Smith, the creator of Bone, um,
Hmm.
which is an amazing comic series that was released. Like now it's you can get it in like a giant volume that's as thick as a dictionary, and just these deep, deep stories of these characters. And yeah, I mean, I love discovering new stories and finding like artists that are doing weird things. I like discovering something that maybe not a lot of people know about, and just people trying new things and trying new mediums, and that's what gets me excited is when people are experimental. And because as you mentioned on my website, I like to experiment and try new things, and even things that aren't entirely successful. I love when people have tried something new with it.
Yeah, yeah, and I think we can probably do more of that and just kind of the whole running with scissors type thing.
Bam.
I'm just going to try it and see what happens. And if it works, great. I've stumbled on something great. If it fails, oh well, I learned something. Let's keep going.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, that's a lot of my
yeah,
career has been that kind of like I just get excited to make something and to make it. Like a lot of my creative projects ended up costing me more money instead of making me money because I was just excited to try something weird and new. And a lot of times even like not even stopping to think about what is the audience of this comic, and like is this going to make sense to anyone but me. Some of my earlier book projects ended up online, but I mean that's what I always recommend to people who want to make a living as a writer is write the things that only you can write. uh for me, growing up making comics, it was always everyone's like, oh, you got to go work for Marvel or DC, you got to make superhero comics. And I enjoy superhero comics, I enjoy superhero movies, but that's not what the stories I'm passionate about telling. And if I were to just sit down and be like, well, that's what sells, that's what I got to make, I'm making a lesser version of something that's already popular and that there are 100 million people already doing that are so much better
right.
at it than me. I'm never going to find success doing that. But the book of mine that's been the most successful is called Banned Book Club, and that's the true story of my wife being hunted down by the police in under a dictator in 1980s Korea for reading books the president didn't like, and no one else is going to make that book, and it's become incredibly successful because it's no one else was making books like that. My series Student Ambassador is based on my own experiences when I was a student ambassador in high school, and I traveled to Australia and that book series is like what I wish it had been like. What it, if it I like what I had pictured in my head of like international adventures. No one else is gonna make that. So that's the kind of story that I try to tell.
Yeah. How do you remain creative? Because like for me in music, for example, there's just days where I'm like, man, I'm just not feeling it today. But I know I got to do the thing
Mhm.
to keep myself moving forward. But sometimes there's just nothing in the tank.
Mhm.
How do you stay creative at all times? Like you're just pumping out so much stuff here.
Well, the advice I always give is the exact opposite of the advice everyone else gives. Because everyone else says you got to get down at the desk and write every single day, no matter what. Even if you're not feeling like it, even if you're feeling sick, even if you're feeling drained, you got to do the work. And I'm like, that absolutely does not work for me. If I do not feel like writing or drawing and I sit down and try and force myself to do it, I'm going to write something, I'm going to draw something that I hate and I'm going to have to redo it tomorrow. And that's going to kill my entire enthusiasm for this project. So I'm going to look at it and be like, this isn't, this book isn't even good. Why am I wasting my time on it? And then redoing it's going to take so much more energy than if I had just waited. And so sometimes I wake up and I'm like, I don't really feel like doing anything. I feel like binge watching clips of a show that I hate on YouTube. I let myself do it. If I'm like, I feel like riding my bike across the country, I'll do it. And then once I've let myself like spend my energy on something else, then I'll be like, oh, you know what I want to do today? I want to work on that book. That was really fun. And then I'll be so
Yeah.
excited that I'll just pour out like 3 months of work in a day because I was so excited to do it. And
Yeah.
by trusting myself and allowing myself to do that, I'm like so full of ideas because when I'm doing all these other things, like when I'm taking a long bike ride, when I'm uh, going on a trip, when I'm watching YouTube, like my brain is like going through ideas of things I want to do. And a lot of times I have to force myself to wear headphones just to keep myself from, I'm like, I have 3 books to finish. Don't invent another book, please. Don't give
Hmm.
yourself more work.
Yeah. We talked to you before we had record that maybe there's a student sitting in class and the subject is ancient history or math or something, and they're like, and they're sitting there drawing in their book and on a piece of paper, and they just have these ideas that come from somewhere, and they're trying to think, how do I take my love for drawing and caricatures and cartooning, and how do I even get to a place where you're at? You're way further down the road than I am. I'm just new at this,
Yep.
but I'm captivated by what you do, and I'm just hungry for any piece of advice you'd have for a young artist on how they can turn their love for art into something that brings them meaning and a career. What kind of things would you say to them?
Well, I would say specifically to that particular kid, even if what your teacher is talking about seems incredibly boring, just kind of even keep doodling, but also listen because every bit of information you get from life
Mm,
is going to impact your work in some way.
that's good.
Even if it is something that you will never use again, you might be writing a scene where someone is hearing something boring they'll never use again and commenting on it,
Hmm.
and then that'll be useful. You might in English class, you might hear about some mythology that you think is boring, but then later you can use one of those elements in a story. You learn about some bit of
Right.
history that either you're writing a story that takes place during that time, or you're writing a story that takes place in the modern day that you can be inspired by something that happened in the past. So, let your mind fill with so much stuff that you're not even going to think about like, oh, let's relate this to the Battle of Gettysburg or whatever. But these things are going to be in your head and recycle without thinking about it. That's specifically that kid. But in general, I think in order to make a living as a creative person, I don't know any two people who have ever done it the same way.
Mm,
And anyone that tells you they have the way, either they're lying to sell you something or they're very confident, they're so confident in exactly what they did and they don't realize that that doesn't apply to anyone else because
right.
uh it's a very, very strange, not one industry, but dozens and dozens of industries that are vaguely interconnected. And it's all about figuring out what works for you. because even if I
Yeah.
told you exactly what I did, it wouldn't work because the thing,
True.
the the way that the creative industries work has changed so much since I started that it's not the same. Things will change tomorrow so much that it won't apply. So the main thing to do is what I said before, make the stories that only you can make. And while you're making them for yourself, especially, don't worry about what's going to sell, what's mainstream, because that's what, years from now, some editor is going to think about that when they look at your work. For right now, you can make literally anything you want and no one can stop you. So make something so friggin' weird that no one would ever pay you to make it, because when you start off, nobody's going to be paying you to make stuff at the start anyway. So don't make stuff for other people. Make stuff that you're excited about. And then with the industry we have right now, the internet, like you can make something and put it on the internet. And if there are like 10 people who are exactly the same level of weird that you are, they're going to find that and it's going to be their favorite thing they've ever seen because no one else has made anything so specifically for them. And you'll realize that that audience is never that small. It's going to grow. They're going to tell their friends. They're going to tell their friends. And, you can make something niche that about the things that you're passionate about. If you have some weird hobby, like I always tell people, like if you're into, I don't know, disc golf, or if you're into gardening, if you're into model trains, whatever weird hobby you're into, if you make a story about that, set a romance at a convention, set a mystery about someone, a dead body is found in a game or whatever this hobby is. And other people interested in that are going to be drawn to it. But then people interested in that genre you're doing are going to learn about the thing you're passionate about, and that passion is going to come through. So make that thing you're passionate about. And then once you're done and you figure out who your audience is, then you can figure out what your next step is. And it might involve, now we start talking to publishers and see if someone wants to finance one of these things and give me an advance, or see if I can get an agent off of this, and just build up an audience first, because it's getting your work out there and getting attention to it is how all of these things start, no matter what route you're going to go. If you can go to a publisher and say, I already have an audience, I have people that love my work, then you're already steps ahead.
So I see on your website too that you've worked with some classic characters as well.
Yeah.
I see Star Trek, I see Popeye, I see Flash Gordon. Tell me a little bit about that too. Like, what does that feel like to have some kind of input and the ability to work with some pretty classic things that people are very identifiable? As soon as you say Popeye, I know exactly in my head who that is. So tell me a little bit, how did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, specifically working on Garfield is so full circle for me, because like I said, I started off trying to rip him off, and now I'm doing the real thing. But yeah, I mean,
amazing.
The weird thing about doing things like that is that it's a very weird thing to break into, because you can't pitch for it, because especially like these big names like that, they don't want you to say, hey, I have an idea for a Popeye comic or Garfield comic or Star Trek, because there's so many people working on it that if I said, for example, if I'm pitching, I'll give you an example. Just recently, I had a weird dream about Popeye, and I tweeted about it. A dream where Popeye was a detective, and I tweeted about it, and I tagged the person, my editor from Popeye Comics, and I said, "This was a dream, but now I want to read this." And the editor was kind of mad at me, and she's like, "You can't tag me in these things, because now, if of all the things we're doing with Popeye, if anyone ever writes a scene where he's a detective, then we have legal trouble, because you could come and say that I stole your idea." And that's so generic that, like, of course Popeye could be a detective, But so you can't really go and say, I want to work on this. Things like that come from first building a reputation and then hoping they come to you. And you can make sure that you can figure out who the editors are in charge of those things, and, get to know them and talk to them and find out what they're working on. But you can't really go to them with pitches. with things like Garfield, Popeye, Flash Gordon, those are people that came to me and said, uh, those are specifically cases where they're looking for different artists to take on the the characters and put their spin on it. And so those were really fun, like having freedom to do whatever I wanted. There's another realm of that that I haven't really gotten into where uh, I heard they're a real slog because um, you know, there's ones where the people who own the characters are so picky that I've known people who worked on comics of like TV shows and they have to every single actor in the TV show has to approve every drawing of them and yet and
Wow.
then every director and every writer and so much back and forth and they're like no you can do this no you can't do that um but yeah I've luckily all the ones I've done have been like be creative, get weird, go nuts. And so I have a lot of fun
Yeah.
doing that. But I'd love to start doing more of those.
For a very creative person, I have a question that comes up often with the authors I talk to. There's a little bit of concern, trepidation around the whole world of AI
Yeah.
and all of that, and it maybe replacing authors and creative works. And I can go to a site, click a button, and get an image for my whatever. And I'm like, I'm just curious as your thoughts around AI, how you see it impacting your part of the world, because your creativity is evident. You can see it all over here. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are around that, and maybe what you see down the road for creative people.
Well, I think first of all, of course, there's no ethical existence of AI at this point because every single version of it that's publicly available is done with stolen artwork and that's been scraped. And I have friends that are involved in lawsuits about specifically their work being admitted in court that their work was used. But the main issue with AI is that it's it's never going to make something people want to read because taking the humanity out of it and just regurgitating into something. So like it's even the people who are pushing for it know that it's never going to be creating real stories and entertainment. But what the people in power know is that if they have an AI program turn out some real garbage and then hand it to a writer and say fix it, that writer is then going to have to basically start from scratch to make it good. But then they don't have to pay them for writing; they can pay them for editing, which is significantly less, and they have significantly less rights. So that's really what they're focusing on. Is we want the same people to be writing our stuff. We just want an excuse to say they didn't write it, and there's going to be a lot of that going on, and that's what a lot of the strikes and things have been, looking at, is how to keep people from abusing this technology to take rights away from creators who are fixing things made from stuff that was stolen from them to begin with.
Yeah, that's a very interesting comment because it had to pull something from somewhere to even start. So that's interesting that. Because I can see it. I can see it in some of the work that comes out. Everything seems very vanilla when it comes from AI. There's no special anything to it. It's kind of basic. Everything's very basic or very flowery to the point where I don't sound like that. I wouldn't write like that. I wouldn't draw like that. It just seems different than what I would do. And I think when I talk to authors and people in the creative space that when AI is going crazy and everybody's falling in love with it, to stand out and do your thing makes you even more evident. More, you do stand out more because you're creative and it's your work, it's your words, your art, your thoughts, your live story. AI has never been broken up with. AI has never fallen off a bicycle. AI has no idea about these things that you talked about earlier that make you unique. They've never experienced it. So you can tap into something that AI can't at this point, and you can leverage that to be creative. So, yeah, I love it. So you have 2 books coming into the world, which I love, and you got so much more on your plate. What does a typical day in the life look like for you, Ryan? Like, Are you jumping from project to project, or people reaching out to you to do new things? What does it look like for you in a creative space? When you have a job like a typical 9 to 5, somebody gives you tasks, you do them, you go home. You're living this all the time, so I'm really curious as to how you make this all work. What does a typical day or week look like for you in this space?
I mean, that's what I love, is being able to jump around between projects. Like I said, some of the stuff I do as young adult, some stuff I do as teen, some of the stuff I'm illustrating, some of it I'm just writing. So I get to every day be like, look at what my deadlines are, what's coming up, and okay, I better work on this, or actually I'm going to work on this. And like right now I'm waiting for feedback. I did the pencils for a book, and I'm waiting for feedback back on that until I can ink. So I'm like, let's start writing the next book, and I'm working on that. Just finished writing a few issues of a Garfield comic, so I got those into the editor, and now, some days it's like I have a deadline coming up on this book, so this book is all I can think about, and then sometimes I have a window where it's like I probably too often I'm like, let's start something new, which I probably shouldn't, because as soon as I get that feedback, I'm going to have months and months of work to do fixing all the notes I made. But I like starting new things. And I kind of drive my agent crazy when I am in that mode where I'm waiting, because I'll be like, I just wrote like 3 new books and I have pitches for 10 more. She's like, slow down, man. Slow down. I'm trying to sell the other books you got me.
It's amazing. And then on top of all this, you have movies as well, I see on your website. Talk to us about what you've done with this. It's a totally different thing than writing a book and artwork. Tell me more about the movies.
Well, I mean, the thing I love about creativity is working with other artists and collaborating and trying new things. I always am excited to try new art forms, even though I love making comics. I love doing other things, and I didn't used to be as outgoing as I am, because I used to be incredibly shy, but I started doing this thing called the Not My Jam Challenge, where if I catch myself turning down any opportunity for any reason other than it, or for solely because it's not my thing, I have to do it. So I can turn something down because it's too expensive, I don't have time, I'm morally opposed. All these things are fine. I'm not Jim Carrey from Yes Man. But if I just, like, when I moved to Korea, someone invited me to tell a story at an open mic. And I'm like, I don't really do that. And I'm like, oh, now I have to do it. So I did that, and it turned out great. And then someone came up to me after and said, hey, man, we need an extra person for our Shakespeare play. You want to do that? I'm like, oh, I'm not an actor. Oh, now I have to do it. And so I started doing that. And then someone said, hey, we're doing, we need someone at the radio station. So I got a job at the radio station. Then I started directing podcasts. And then someone invited me to be in a filmmaking competition. So I joined in that. And then I wrote some scripts for that. And eventually I directed one. And I've tried all of these different art forms. And I've fallen in love with them. And a lot of them I keep doing. A lot of the films that I've made have been for like 72-hour film festivals that people have done here in Busan. And then several of them have ended up being accepted at the Busan International Short Film Festival, which was the first Oscar qualifying festival in Asia. And just fun, silly little things. But I've also worked on bigger projects sometimes just for fun. I was in a Bollywood movie once, one of the worst Bollywood movies ever made. I was a voiceover actor. I was a gator wrangler on a movie in Florida once. These are things that, like, I'm not going to make a career as a Bollywood voiceover actor or a gator or Florida children's film gator wrangler, but it's sure fun to try.
I love it. I think that's an amazing challenge. Where did the Not My Jam challenge come from? Was that something you pulled from somebody, or you come up with yourself?
No,
I love it.
It's just kind of something that I forced myself to do because I wanted to have new experiences, and I caught myself turning down too many opportunities.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So do you work with people? Like, can some person reach out to you and say, hey, I'm looking for some artwork for whatever, blah, blah, blah. Can people hire you? Or is this something where you're already so busy you're not really looking for clients or any client work?
I'm always like kind of shifting what I do, but these days I tend not to illustrate anything that I don't write. And I don't even illustrate all the things that I do write, just because for me, writing is the part that I'm passionate about. And the part, I love drawing, but drawing for me is work. And writing is just the natural state of my brain that I can't stop
Hmm.
it. So I
Nice.
love writing, and I'm always looking for new writing opportunities. And then once I write something, I decide, is this something I should draw or something that I should work with? I have several collaborators that I work with regularly and also work with other artists. Um, but yeah, I'm always excited for new writing projects, but I'm trying to slow myself down on drawing because I'm so slow at it that I'm like, if I draw a book, like I could have written 20 books in that time.
I love it. So, Brian, before we go off and finish up today, just any kind of words of encouragement for this audience. Again, we have young creative people, whether they're authors, artists, creative people, people doing movies and writing scripts. A lot of people listening to the show from different avenues of creative space. Having somebody like you on the show just inspires me to now go do something, which is good. But I would love for you to just kind of talk to the listener
Yeah.
and help them understand how much we need their creative input in this world of ours. I want to encourage them. I want them to hear a voice in the space
Yeah.
encouraging us to take a big leap and do the thing.
Yeah.
What would you say to the person listening to get them to spark towards making a commitment, and then again using that not my jam challenge maybe to be the spark
Yeah.
for them to get going? But what's your words of wisdom we can share as we kind of close off today?
Yeah, well, my words of wisdom always, I have a lot of people that have come up to me and said, I'm an aspiring writer. What should I do? And my comment is always, how dare you? You are not an aspiring writer. This is not being a doctor. You don't need a certificate. No one's going to tell you whether or not you're a writer. Guess what? You're a writer. If you're asking me that question, you're a writer. If you're asking that question, you're an artist. Uh, that's all it takes is if that's what you feel that you are, if that's what you want to do, you are an artist and a writer. So just make something. Don't sit down. I'm sure, I know that you have an idea in your head for like a 30-year project that's going to involve multiple volumes that are 300 pages each, and eventually it's going to take up a whole bookshelf. That's great. That's not your first project. Make something short. Make it 12. If you're a cartoonist, try a 24-hour comic. That's a thing where you sit down for 24 hours, draw a page per hour, and at the end of the day, you have a book. It may be terrible, but you have a book, and you can be like, hey, all right, if I had a little bit more time, I'd do this differently. If a little bit more time, I'd do this differently. And then you don't have that hang over your head of like, I need to finish something. You have finished something, you know what it's like, and you know what to do. Same thing if you're writing a novel. There's National Novel Writing Month and things like that, but you can make your own challenges. You can just be like, I'm going to write a short story this week and do it and get it out there. Once you have something that you've made, don't be afraid to put it on the internet and see what people think. And the other very important bit of advice is that failure is amazing. Do not be afraid of failure. If you make something, it doesn't connect with an audience, it doesn't get picked up, you send it to a publisher, they don't answer you, an agent rejects it, that is not failure. And don't be like, I guess my career is over because that didn't happen. Everyone that's successful has failed hundreds of times, and usually it's the failures that find them success. To give a little history of mine, like I said, I've been doing this since I was 6 years old. I've made hundreds of books. That doesn't mean anyone's ever read them. It wasn't until Banned Book Club came out in 2020 that all of a sudden I started winning awards and getting good reviews and hitting bestseller lists, and people started being interested. I made a lot of books that I just put on my website, and maybe 4 people read them. And one of them was a book, probably my first graphic novel was called Aki Alliance. And I put it on my website, or I was running it online, and then I submitted it to every single editor, every single publisher, every single agent, rejected by everybody in the industry. So I'm like, whatever, I'll just put it on my website, forgot about it. And then like 20 years later, I got this random email from Disney asking if the rights were available to make a TV show. And I'm like, I forgot I made that book. How did you find it? And the TV show didn't end up happening, but like it shows you never know who's going to find these things that you make and what life is going to come from
Wow.
them later. And
Wow.
that project kind of fell apart disastrously, and a couple others fell apart disastrously. And it was because of those disasters that the lawyer I was working with was like, you know what, I think you need an agent to help you deal with this stuff. And he introduced me to folks at WME, William Morris, which is like the biggest agency, like they represent Oprah, they represented Charlie Chaplin, they represented Elvis Presley and Marilyn Monroe. Like there's no
Wow.
reason I'm a guy who makes comics in my bedroom. I should not be with this agency. But because I failed, someone introduced me to this opportunity, and that has changed my life immeasurably. Having both
Wow.
book agents, film and TV agents, and now, like I mentioned, my agent being so open to like make whatever you want. It's my job to sell it. And then like again, I always thought I didn't need an agent. And then the first time she sent me a book deal offer, I was like, I think you have a typo. There's too many zeros. And she's like, no, that's how much they offered you. I'm like, you can make money doing this crap? What? Nobody told me. So make things and don't be afraid to fail, because your failures are what's going to lead to your success, even if you don't see a path that it could possibly take. There's going to be weird twists. There's going to be weird turns. But the connections you're going to make and the things you're going to learn are what's going to lead to all of the success you're going to have.
Wow. And that's the long, arduous journey to overnight success.
Yeah.
Right? I love it. And then I see, too, one last thing before we go, is I see you have some podcast experience you mentioned before. Did you have your own stuff that we can go listen to as well, which is great. So tell us about your podcast endeavor.
Yeah, I've in the past I've written some audio dramas. Just experimenting with new mediums, and I did one called Big Data, and there's a few others that I just kind of got a bunch of actors together and all the people I wanted to collaborate with, and got musicians and actors and poets, and we kind of got together to tell stories, and yeah, those are all available on my website as well.
And I see the 3-time Moth Story Slam winner. Interesting.
Yeah, that's something I really recommend for people who want to tell stories, is getting on a stage and telling a story. And Moth is a great place to do that. Because it's interesting when you watch an audience listen to a story. You can write a book and later you might read a review, but you never get that immediate feedback. And especially if you go to different types of events and tell the same story and see how audiences react differently, it's fascinating, especially if you're telling true stories, because not like you can change the story, but you can realize, oh, wait, if I pause half a second, it makes the audience realize something and then they laugh. And then you can tell the exact same story, but the pause is slightly different and they stone-faced, don't react at all. And you'd be like, that's interesting. And I see why it happened. And how can I relate that to a comic? How can I relate that to prose? Do I have that realization happen as the person turns the page? Do I like put the setup here so that as they're turning the page, they have time to build an expectation in their head, and then I subvert that expectation? And then there's situations where, like, I have a story about a true experience about the time I was thrown from a moving train by the police. And I thought it was a fascinating story, but I never really got a reaction from anyone. And then one day I was telling it on the story on stage, and all of a sudden, looking at people's faces, I realized, oh, wait, I'm the bad guy of this story. That's why I don't get a reaction. I'm telling it wrong. And then you tell the same story, but from the perspective of knowing I was wrong, and suddenly it gives them permission to laugh. So yeah, it really, even if it's terrifying to tell a story in front of a crowd, you get so much information from the audience that will affect the way you write.
Love it. I love it. Excellent. Ryan, thank you so much for taking time away from all of the things you're doing to talk with us. I appreciate it. And it's exciting to connect with you. I would love to keep following your journey. And how can we do that? Where do we go for your website and even more information about you? Where would you like to send us?
Easiest place to go is ryanestrada.com, and that has links to all the socials. There's hundreds of pages of free comics you can read there. Like I said, a lot of things no one wanted to publish, so I put them on there. You can read them for free, but there's also information in all my books, like I mentioned Banned Book Club, the Student Ambassador series. My new book, Student Ambassador, The Silver City, just came out this week. That's a kind of adventure series for kids, and that one he goes to Zacatecas, Mexico, and has to solve a mystery of monsters in a mine. And I got to make comic about my grandfather's hometown, and that was great. And then in October, I have a book called No Rules Tonight, which is a standalone follow-up to Banned Book Club that is based on how in the 1980s of Korea, there was a curfew where if you were out after midnight, you go to jail. But the only exception, because the curfew was started by American soldiers, was they made an exception on December 24th, which meant something to them, but not so much to a lot of the people in Korea. So December 24th became the one night you could do whatever you wanted. So we made a story about what would you do with that one night of freedom. And Ooh. I got I'm working on so many things, but go to ryanestrada.com and you'll see all of them.
Awesome. Ryan, thank you so much for doing this. Really appreciate having you on the show and making time for us. From where I am here in Canada, on the other side of the world, it's amazing what we can do through the internet. I love this. It's awesome. Right? And for you to take time to do this, I really appreciate it. Thank you, Ryan.
I appreciate you having me.
Hey, thanks for listening all the way to the end of the podcast. That's a big signal to all of the players, the YouTubes, the Apples, the Spotifys, that you found value in this episode of Living the Next Chapter. Just by you listening to the end, you just sent a huge bat signal out to the app saying this was a great podcast, a great conversation. So you listening to this point, you've done your job. I have one more ask of you. If you know anyone that would benefit from this conversation, would you share this episode with them? Would you just send them a message, send them the episode, tell them about this episode, tell them to go livinginthenextchapter.com to get all the information about the podcast. Can you do that for me? Because the more people that hear this message, this episode, the better. I want to support these amazing authors, and I know you do as well. So sharing this episode really helps, and I appreciate you. See you on the next episode, and thank you for listening to Living the Next Chapter.